All right, so you sent in some really interesting material about this guy Pietro Pomponazzi, a Renaissance philosopher who really kind of shook things up a bit. I'm excited to dive into this with you. What were your first impressions when you were looking at the stuff?
My first thought was that this is a window into a really, really pivotal moment in intellectual history. I mean, this is a guy who was like really grappling with some of the biggest questions you can think of, especially the immortality of the soul, right? Like he dared to question church doctrine on that and said, well, maybe it's not a given, this eternal existence thing. Pretty bold move when you think about like the potential
Yeah,
consequences.
no kidding. So for this deep dive, what do you say we try to understand how he arrived at some of these conclusions? Like, how did he get to this point, and why does it matter? Even for someone studying philosophy today.
I think to really get Pomponazzi, you've got to start with the context. I mean, he was born in 1462, right in the middle of the Italian Renaissance.
Yeah, it was a pretty crazy time to be alive, I bet.
Oh yeah, total explosion of energy, intellectual ferment everywhere, just bubbling over.
And it wasn't just like he was living through it. The source material says he was a professor at Padua and Bologna. Like, those were some serious intellectual hubs,
Well,
right?
absolutely. Those were like the big leagues of Renaissance thought. And think about it. This is just after the printing press has totally revolutionized how knowledge is spread. Ancient Greek texts are being rediscovered and debated left and right. And there's this real spirit of questioning everything that had been taken for granted for centuries.
And he gets so deep into Aristotle. It's interesting that he challenges the church, but was so influenced by him. The sources even say he admired Thomas Aquinas, who was like super aligned with church teachings.
Yeah, his relationship with Aquinas is kind of fascinating. He really respected Aquinas's intellect, but felt like his arguments relied way too much on theological assumptions. Like Pomponazzi was all about a kind of pure Aristotle, focused on natural philosophy and evidence you could actually observe. It was almost like he was trying to pry apart philosophy and theology.
Which probably ruffled some feathers. Was that a common debate back then, or was he really out on a limb with that idea?
Oh, it was definitely a touchy subject. Guys like Albertus Magnus had already made a case for different methods when you're studying nature versus divine matters. But Pomponazzi took it further. He said, look, philosophy and theology need to operate in totally separate spheres with their own rules. And that really challenged the church's authority when it came to things like the soul and the afterlife, which they considered their territory.
So let's get into that. His most famous, or maybe infamous, work is on the immortality of the soul. That's where he really goes after this idea of the soul living forever.
Hmm.
What's the heart of his argument there?
So it's really carefully built. Like he's drawing on what he sees as the real core of Aristotle's teachings. A big part of it hinges on this idea of phantasms.
Hmm.
Now, to get that, you have to understand how Aristotle thought we learn things. He was all about the senses, right? Like our understanding of the world comes from sensory experience. And phantasms in this context, they're basically like mental pictures that come from our senses.
So you're saying our thoughts are basically just sensory images. That's tying it to the physical body, which is interesting.
Exactly, that's the link. Because Pomponazzi argues that if thinking is based on senses, and senses die with the body, then thought and the soul, since the soul is the source of thought, can't exist on their own.
I can follow the logic, but even if he's basing it on Aristotle, I'm sure the church wasn't exactly thrilled with this whole line of thinking. I mean, what were the implications if he's right?
The implications were massive because, if there's no individual soul that survives after death to like experience heaven or hell, that blows up the whole Christian doctrine of judgment and salvation. It messes with their whole reward and punishment system, really shakes the foundations of their beliefs.
So was he like trying to stir up trouble, or do you think he was genuinely just, pursuing these ideas from a philosophical standpoint?
He was walking a tightrope, that's for sure. The sources suggest he was like super careful. He even put disclaimers in his writing, saying he totally submits to church authority when it comes to faith. But his arguments are obviously challenging the church's teachings and people are talking. Like it sparks this big debate.
It's like this tension between faith and reason, right? We're still dealing with that today in a lot of ways. He was trying to create space for philosophical inquiry, even when it led to places that were maybe maybe a little bit dangerous.
Absolutely. And that's where it gets even more interesting, especially for someone coming at this from a philosophical angle, because he didn't stop with the soul. He took this same commitment to natural explanations and applied it to all sorts of other stuff that people were attributing to the supernatural back then.
You're talking about on incantations,
Right. Yeah.
where he gets into things like miraculous cures, magic, all that. I mean, some of his explanations there were they were really kind of ahead of their time when you think about what people generally believed back then.
Yeah, and that's where you see like his forward thinking instead of just jumping to, oh, it's demons like so many people did back then. He was looking for natural causes.
That's where his theory about occult qualities comes in,
Hmm.
right? This idea that things in nature have these hidden properties that could do all sorts of crazy stuff.
Precisely. It's almost like he's anticipating modern ideas about, things like the placebo effect or the power of the mind-body connection. He's recognizing that there are these forces in nature that we don't totally get, but he refuses to just label them as magic or supernatural.
Hold on, let's break down these occult qualities a little more. What are some examples he uses to show these hidden properties?
Well, he draws from a lot of different stuff, like the power of magnets or how certain fish can shock their prey. He even talks about the healing properties of plants and this belief that the remora, which is this tiny fish, could actually stop ships by clinging to their hulls.
So it's like he's saying, "Hey, look, nature's way more complex than we think. Let's not just jump to magical explanations. Let's try to actually figure out how things work."
Exactly. He's pushing for a more nuanced view of the natural world, challenging people to move beyond these simplistic explanations based on magic and superstition. He's laying the groundwork for a more scientific worldview, even though he's still rooted in the philosophy of his time.
And it wasn't just the physical world, right? He applied this idea of natural explanations to human psychology, too. Like he was really into the power of the imagination.
That's right. He believed that the imagination itself could actually have real effects on the body. One example he uses is how a pregnant woman's thoughts could shape her developing baby, which was, a pretty common belief at the time.
It's amazing how he's wrestling with ideas that seem so modern. Centuries before we had things like psychology or the whole study of the mind-body connection. So, I mean, given how radical his ideas were, I have to ask, how did people react to him during his lifetime?
Well, it's a mixed bag, really. Some people saw him as this dangerous radical who was, undermining faith and morality. Others hailed him as a brilliant philosopher who was challenging the status quo. I mean, his legacy is still debated by scholars today.
Sounds like he was a true provocateur,
Mhm.
which, says a lot about how deeply his ideas challenged the way people saw the world. But we're just getting started. There's so much more to unpack in Pomponazzi's world of ideas.
One thing that really strikes me about Pomponazzi, especially coming at it from a philosophy perspective, is his real commitment to like being rigorous. He wasn't just throwing out opinions. He wanted to show you why he thought what he thought, really make a solid argument.
Which makes sense, given how much he stressed separating philosophy from theology. The sources mention this idea of in naturalibus. I think that connects to his approach. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Oh, definitely. In Naturalibus is all about Pomponazzi saying, look, we need to base our explanations in the natural world, what we can observe, what we can reason about. He was committed to the via peripatetica, which is the Aristotelian method, emphasizing evidence and logic.
So, like, when it came to the soul, he was basically saying, let's stick to what we can actually see and think about, rather than relying on faith.
Exactly. And that's where his reading of Aristotle gets really fascinating. He was convinced that Aristotle, if you really understand his natural philosophy, didn't actually believe in the soul being immortal, which, scholars still debate that today, but it was central to Pomponazzi's whole argument.
It's a pretty bold move, going up against the church on something that fundamental.
Yeah.
Wasn't he, like, worried about being labeled a heretic?
Oh, he was definitely in dangerous territory. The sources actually say he was accused of heresy multiple times. But his defense was always, hey, I'm just giving you a faithful reading of Aristotle, not necessarily saying I agree with all of it, trying to draw that line between philosophical inquiry and church dogma.
It's interesting, though. Do you think he actually believed the soul was mortal? Or was he maybe using Aristotle as a way to, kind of poke at the church's authority without being too direct?
It's hard to say for sure what he really believed deep down. Some scholars think he might have been using Aristotle as cover, so he could explore these risky ideas under the banner of philosophical interpretation. Others think he was totally sincere, like he really thought Aristotle's natural philosophy pointed to a mortal soul. Either way, it sparked this huge debate, made people really confront their own assumptions about the soul, about the afterlife, about the whole relationship between faith and reason.
You is a master at pushing boundaries, that's for sure. Testing the limits of what you could even talk about philosophically back then. That's kind of amazing he managed to do it without getting totally shut down.
He was really good at navigating that fine line. Like he often included these disclaimers, right? Professing his submission to the church when it came to faith. But at the same time, his arguments are clearly challenging those very teachings. He's making people re-examine things they thought were settled.
It reminds me of Socrates a little bit. He got
Yeah.
accused of impiety, right, for questioning conventional wisdom. I guess that's part of what drives philosophical progress. Questioning authority, even if it's risky.
Absolutely. It takes real guts to go up against deeply held beliefs, especially when they're tied to religion or politics. And that's what makes Pomponazzi so compelling, even centuries later.
Now, we touched on this earlier, but I want to go back to this idea of wondrous nature and these occult qualities. That's where I think he shows this really almost like prescient understanding of the natural world.
It's definitely one of the most fascinating parts of his work. I mean, you got to remember, this was a time when people were still explaining tons of stuff through supernatural forces, demons, divine intervention, all that. But Pomponazzi, he was insisting on finding natural explanations.
It's like even though he's working within the philosophy of his time, he's almost laying the groundwork for a more scientific approach to understanding the universe.
You're right, and his whole thing about occult qualities is a great example of that. He's saying, look, there are these forces at work that we don't fully grasp yet, but let's investigate them, try to figure them out, not just write them off as magic.
But I mean, weren't these occult qualities just another form of magical thinking? What made his approach different from the more superstitious beliefs that were common back then?
That's a great question. And yeah, some of his language might sound a bit mystical to us now, but he was really searching for natural causes. They were just, hidden or occult in his terminology. Remember, this is before the scientific method really takes hold. He's dealing with a world that's mostly unexplained, and he's trying to make sense of it without resorting to the supernatural.
So what were some of the natural causes he was proposing? What kind of occult qualities did he think were operating out there?
He pulls from a lot of different places. The properties of magnets, how certain fish can create electricity, the medicinal effects of plants. He was drawn to the things that seemed inexplicable, but he approaches them with this spirit of inquiry, trying to find underlying principles.
It's like he's trying to map out these hidden forces in nature, categorize them, make sense of them. He's not content with just saying, well, that's just how it is. He wants to understand the how.
Yeah, exactly. And then he takes it even further, right? It's not just the physical world. He applies this to human psychology too, especially the power of imagination. He realized that our thoughts, our beliefs, they could actually have a real impact on our bodies. An idea that's like way ahead of its time.
That example with the pregnant woman and how her thoughts could affect her baby is a really powerful one. It shows that he was aware of this mind-body connection, something that we wouldn't really start to explore in depth for centuries.
Right. He was onto something there, even if his explanations might seem a little basic to us now. He was really breaking down these barriers that people had built between philosophy and the study of the natural world, moving towards a more holistic understanding of what it means to be human.
And then, of course, he doesn't shy away from those really big questions about fate and free will.
Yeah.
Stuff that's puzzled philosophers forever. What was his take on all that?
That's where his determinism comes in. Pomponazzi was arguing that the universe operates according to this fixed order. Everything that happens flows from God's initial act of creation. It's all preset, in a way.
So he's saying everything unfolds according to a plan, including our choices. That doesn't seem to leave much room for free will.
Exactly. He saw free will as kind of an illusion. Our choices are ultimately determined by all these external factors, he argued. The influence of the stars, the circumstances of our birth, how we're raised, all of it. This whole web of causes.
It's a bold claim, especially from a philosophical perspective. If we don't have free will, does that mean we're not responsible for what we do? What about morality? What about striving to be virtuous?
Those are like the really tough questions that Pomponazzi was wrestling with. And while he believed our actions might be predetermined, he didn't think that meant morality was meaningless. He said we still have this moral obligation to aim for virtue, to act in accordance with reason, even within this deterministic framework.
So it's not about being in control of, like, the cosmic machinery, but about making the best choices you can within the rules of that machinery, aligning yourself with the natural order, even if it's fixed.
That's a great way to put it. He saw virtue as his own reward. Living a good life brings you inner peace and harmony, regardless of whether you have free will in the traditional sense.
It's a challenging idea, but it does connect to some other philosophical traditions, like Stoicism, for example, which emphasizes accepting what you can't control.
For sure. And Pomponassi's whole take on determinism raises all these questions about free will, moral responsibility, what it means to be a human agent. We're still debating those things in philosophy today, and his contributions are still really relevant. One of the things that I find so interesting about Pomponazzi, especially if you're, really into philosophy, is how much he embraces doubt. Like he sees it as a crucial part of intellectual growth.
That's a really cool point. You wouldn't necessarily think a guy who's challenging the church would be all about skepticism. Was that a common view back in the Renaissance?
He was definitely like walking a fine line there.
Yeah.
You got to remember, this is a time when questioning church doctrine could get you in some serious trouble. But Pomponazzi, he thought real knowledge. It comes from questioning things, from wrestling with uncertainty. He saw doubt not as like a weakness, but as something that pushes you to understand things more deeply.
So it's about like constantly checking your assumptions, refining what you think you know as you get more evidence, more insights. Almost sounds like a precursor to the scientific method in a way.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. He wasn't claiming to have all the answers. In fact, he often talked about, how limited human knowledge really is, especially when you're dealing with these big questions about the soul or how the universe works. He thought that by admitting what we don't know, we actually open ourselves up to new possibilities, new ways of seeing things.
There's a real humility there, which is pretty striking, especially given how deep he goes into fate and predestination. It takes a lot of like intellectual courage to say, hey, there are things we just can't know for sure.
Absolutely. And his approach to those like age-old questions, it's really nuanced. He didn't just accept the traditional views on fate and free will. He really breaks them down, explores what they would mean if they were true, challenges the assumptions behind them.
Yeah, we talked earlier about his deterministic view of the universe, how he thought everything unfolds according to a plan. How did he square that with the idea of moral responsibility? If our choices are already determined, are we really accountable for our actions?
That's one of the trickiest parts of his philosophy, for sure. He acknowledged the tension between determinism and free will, but he maintained that even if the universe is deterministic, it's still crucial to try to live a virtuous life.
So it's less about like having control over the whole cosmic picture and more about doing your best within the rules of that picture.
Exactly. He argued that we have this moral obligation to align our actions with reason and to seek what he called the mean, which is basically like a state of balance and moderation in all things. He thought that by doing this, by pursuing virtue, you find inner peace and harmony regardless of what's happening around you.
It's fascinating. It's like he's taking pieces of Aristotelian ethics and weaving them together with his deterministic view of the universe.
You're spot on. He was drawing on all these different philosophical traditions, kind of synthesizing them to deal with the specific intellectual challenges of his time. He was wrestling with huge questions about the nature of reality, the limits of human knowledge, the relationship between faith and reason. And his insights, they're still relevant for us today, especially if you're interested in philosophy.
It really is mind-blowing how a philosopher writing over 500 years ago can still speak to us like this. His ideas, they make us question our own assumptions about the world,
Right.
grapple with these big questions that have been around for centuries.
That's the power of philosophy, right? It's this ongoing conversation, this constant exploration of what it means to be human, to try to understand ourselves and the universe.
This whole deep dive into Pomponazzi has been amazing. I'm so glad we had this conversation, and I think our listeners are going to walk away with a much deeper understanding of this really complex and often controversial thinker.
It's been a pleasure, really. Pomponazzi's work reminds us that philosophy, it's not just some abstract academic thing. It's about engaging with the world, wrestling with the big questions that shape our lives.
And on that note, I want to leave our listeners with this. What about Pomponazzi's ideas really resonated with you? Did his philosophy challenge your beliefs or maybe reinforce them when it comes to the soul or the nature of reality or the limits of what we can know? I encourage you to keep exploring the world of Renaissance thought. Check out some other thinkers who tackle these timeless questions. You might be surprised how relevant their ideas still are today, even in the 21st century.